was June 2008, and I was on my way to work at around 6:30 in the morning. I'd grown up in Calhoun, Georgia, a small town where eerie tales were as common as the early morning dew. That day, despite the urgency of getting to work on time, the sky was still dim, the sun having yet to rise, casting long shadows and a sense of foreboding over the landscape. My workplace was about 6 miles from home, a 20-minute drive under normal conditions. Yet the relentless Georgia rain had transformed the familiar roads into slick, treacherous paths. I wasn't an expert driver, and I'd only recently mastered riding my motorcycle, the old Honda Rebel 300 my dad had passed down to me, modified to handle 2 riders. Even with those modifications, every twist and turn of the stormy morning left me with a racing heart, the steady drumming of raindrops against the dark pavement adding to the disquiet. As I navigated a narrow, unpaved road turned muddy by the downpour, I suddenly noticed her, an elderly woman, soaked to the bone, standing hesitantly at the edge of the road. Dressed in a faded floral dress with a neatly wrapped scarf around her head, a look that unmistakably marked her as a grandmother. She appeared almost spectral in the murk of pre-dawn gloom. In Calhoun, you learned quickly not to ignore those in need. With a trembling hand, she signaled for me to stop. I pulled over, my voice tentative as I spoke. "Ma'am, it's dangerous out here. The road's too slippery, and I'm still getting the hang of riding." Despite my motorcycle being modified for 2, I felt a deep hesitation. I expected her to nod in understanding and wait safely by the roadside, but she didn't. Before I could say another word, she climbed onto the back of the bike. There was something undeniably unsettling about her presence, a chill that crept up my spine, amplified by the eerie silence of a morning where the sun had yet to break the darkness. Reluctantly, I started the engine, and we merged back onto the slippery road. For a long while, we rode in silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic swish of tires over puddles and the constant hum of the engine, punctuated by the occasional distant rumble of thunder. I kept stealing glances at her, trying to read the story etched into the lines of her weathered face, but she remained impassive, her eyes fixed on some unseen horizon beyond the windshield. In an attempt to break the growing tension, I turned my head slightly and asked, "Ma'am, where are you headed?" My words barely rose above the roar of the rain. Then she slowly leaned in close, so near that I could feel the icy breath of her mouth brushing against my ear. For a long, dreadful moment, I felt that cold exhalation mingle with the sound of the downpour. Finally, in a voice that was both unnervingly calm and chillingly cold, she whispered, "Where you're going." I froze. How could she possibly know my destination? I hadn't mentioned anything about where I was headed. My hands began to tremble on the handlebars as a deep, unsettling fear took hold. The rain intensified, each drop hammering against the metal of my motorcycle, mirroring the frantic rhythm in my ears. All I wanted was to get to work and escape this surreal terror. Time seemed to stretch as the oppressive silence of the storm enveloped us. Then, as abruptly as the conversation had taken that dark turn, she spoke again, her tone devoid of any warmth. "Stop here." Without thinking, I pulled over. The bike came to a reluctant halt on the rain-drenched road in the middle of nowhere. I turned around slowly, scanning the murky surroundings in the scant early light. In the distance, an old gas station stood silently, its windows boarded up and wild, overgrown grass taking over the lot. The eerie stillness of that desolate spot sent a chill down my spine, a stark reminder that the sun hadn't yet risen to chase away the shadows. When I finally finished taking in the scene and turned back to where I'd last seen her, the elderly woman was gone, vanished as if swallowed by the storm. I thought I was losing my mind. That morning's encounter haunted me all day. At Kroger's, where I worked, the shift was monotonous and utterly boring. Typical small-town routine. I replenished the stock on the shelves, managed the inventory, and occasionally handled online orders. I spent hours navigating endless aisles, checking expiration dates, restocking fresh produce, and coordinating with my coworkers to keep everything running smoothly. The constant hum of the refrigeration units and the beep of the registers barely registered against the backdrop of my racing thoughts. The thought of that creepy encounter lingering in the back of my mind. I was supposed to clock out by 4 p.m., but just as my shift was winding down, my manager pulled me aside with the news that someone had called off. True to my nature, I said yes, without a second thought, even though I can't help but wonder why I keep agreeing to extra work when it feels like they couldn't care less about me. I tried to see the bright side, convincing myself that those additional hours might make a difference or at least supplement my income. So I ended up taking on some extra hours that night, and by the time I finally clocked out at 7 p.m., I was completely exhausted, left alone with the nagging question of why I always say yes, even when it's not really in my best interest. Mounting my motorcycle once again, I set off into the darkened streets, the rain-washed roads now leading me home. As I rode through the quiet, drenched night, I couldn't help but replay that chilling moment over and over in my mind. Then, as I rounded a corner along an empty stretch of road, I saw her again. The same elderly woman in the faded floral dress and headscarf, standing just as she had that stormy morning. For a brief moment, I hesitated. Something deep inside urged me to stop and offer help once more, but the lingering chill from our earlier encounter made my skin crawl, and I found myself driving past her. Only seconds later, an overwhelming dread pushed me to slam on the brakes and turn back. When I returned to that desolate stretch of road, I scanned the area frantically. She was gone, vanished without a trace. Then, in the oppressive silence, I heard a soft, chilling cackle echo through the darkness. It sent a surge of panic through me. I must be losing my mind, I muttered aloud, but there was no time to dwell. Without a second thought, I fired up my motorcycle and sped away, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that eerie place. Even now, I still question whether she was ever real or simply a figment of my haunted imagination, a ghostly presence that emerged from the gloom and vanished without a trace. All that remains is the chilling memory of that rainy day. I'm glad to say this has never happened to me again. When my roommate and I finally decided not to renew our lease, I was forced to make a tough decision. With a heavy heart, I moved back to my grandma's house, a decision born out of necessity rather than desire. It wasn't ideal, enduring a grueling 45-minute commute to work, driving from the unremarkable streets of Lancaster, California, a small city I once called home, to the bustling sprawl of Santa Clarita, tackling the soul-crushing task of downsizing all my belongings and facing the bitter taste of compromise every time I saw my cluttered past packed into a few boxes. Yet, with no rent to pay, I could finally save some money, and as a project manager, barely scraping by, it made sense. Grandma's house was a relic of the past, a place steeped in memories and faint whispers of another era. The house was normal enough, yet carried an atmosphere that was at once comforting and slightly off. Dust motes floated lazily in the afternoon sunlight, filtering through lace curtains, and the cobwebs clung to the corners like reluctant sentinels, spun by the occasional daddy-long legs. The unmistakable grandma's home smell, a heady mix of mothballs, furniture polish, and a mysterious, indefinable tang permeated every room, lending the space a peculiar, almost ghostly nostalgia. I tried to settle into a routine to mask the lingering unease that came with this temporary retreat from my own life. Most days, I barely spent any time at the house during the week. My schedule was as relentless as it was predictable. Wake up at 6 a.m., be at work by 8, clock out at 5:30, and then endure a long, silent commute back home. After a quick change, I'd hit the gym from 7 to 9 before returning home by 10. Once back, I'd shower away the day's exhaustion, eat one of my meticulously prepared meal preps, and then settle in front of the TV to catch an episode of House of Cards, a feeble attempt to distract my racing mind. By the time the credits rolled, I was already succumbing to sleep. Night after night, I was in bed and sound asleep well before midnight. Life was mundane until that one unforgettable night. It began innocuously enough. I had grown accustomed to the soft murmur of Grandma's sleep-talking, a background lullaby of half-remembered dreams and occasional murmurs of distress. But that night, as I lay cocooned under my blankets, something was different. I first heard it, a faint disconcerting exchange between voices that shouldn't have been there. Grandma was talking in her sleep, as usual, but this time an unseen presence was answering her in a guttural, almost static-laced murmur. The words were indistinct, warped by some unseen interference, yet they carried an eerie cadence that unsettled me to the core. I lay frozen, my mind racing with half-formed explanations. Perhaps it was just a dream, I reasoned, a trick of the night. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than the creaks and groans of an old house settling in the cool darkness. But deep down, a prickling sensation told me that something was not right. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every sound took on an ominous edge. As I pulled the blanket tighter around my chest, attempting to bury myself in what little comfort sleep could offer, a sudden jolt of light in the hallway shattered the fragile silence. I sat up with a start. The light was harsh, unyielding, as if trying to tear away the comforting cloak of darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I listened to the soft, measured footsteps that began to echo down the hall. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. It was Grandma's steps, I thought, yet they carried an unfamiliar weight, a gravity that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the night. And then came the moment that sent a chill racing down my spine, a shifting shadow slipping under my door. I couldn't believe my eyes. My heart thundered as I watched, paralyzed as the door, which was normally so mundane and unprotected save for a simple doorstop, now trembled with the sound of jiggling metal. The knob twisted slowly, agonizingly slowly, as if in reluctant surrender to an unseen force. Twice it moved, the sound echoing in the silent room, and then it abruptly ceased, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every thought. I could hear her. The soft, measured footsteps of my grandma, retreating back into the darkness, the light flickering out as her presence faded. Her bedroom door creaked shut behind her, sealing off the mystery that had just intruded into my sanctuary. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, immobilized by fear and uncertainty, staring at the closed door, my mind reeling with questions. What had I just witnessed? Had it been my grandmother or something else entirely? A dark presence that had somehow usurped her familiar silhouette. The following morning, life resumed its monotonous pace. I barely mentioned the incident, fearing that speaking of it might somehow invite the unknown back. I dressed, left for work, and tried to bury the unsettling memories beneath the routine of everyday life. Yet, as the days passed, the echo of that night, the garbled voice, the ghostly footsteps, the persistent image of that jiggling doorknob lingered like a dark cloud over my thoughts. Now, sometimes when the house is quiet and the night is deep, I find myself wondering if it was really my grandma standing at my door, or if it was something else, something that had used her guise as a disguise for its own sinister presence. The mystery remains unresolved, a secret whispered by the shadows in the hall, haunting my every moment and reminding me that not all that seems familiar is truly benign. I was 10 years old at the time, living on Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, Japan, my favorite base out of all of them. My mom was in the Air Force, and together with my dad and grandma, the four of us lived in base housing. I have vivid memories of those days, trading Pokemon cards with friends, waking up at 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday to catch the new episode of Digimon at 8 on AFN, and sitting down on tatami mats at small cozy restaurants. I still remember the delicate beauty of cherry blossoms outside and the quirky sight of small vans with curtains and mini TVs cruising around. My grandma was the heart of our little home. Every morning, before I even got out of bed, I'd find sugar-coated donuts waiting for me. She had prepared them just for me. After breakfast, she would walk me to school. Her gentle presence always comforted me, even though I sometimes felt a little embarrassed that she came with me. Then she would head off to work at the donut shop on the base. A couple of years later, she landed a job at the food court, and I vividly remember getting free Anthony's pizza whenever she was on her shift. Then one day, things changed. We were preparing to move to a new duty station, and Grandma decided to stay behind. I was told she loved the base so much that she wanted her own place. I never really understood it then, but I always admired her independent spirit. One afternoon, our house phone rang, a call from a blocked number. The speaker of the phone announced it was an unknown caller, and then the call kept ringing until it went to voicemail. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, so we relied solely on the landline. When it finally ended, Mom, Dad, and I all heard Grandma's voice say, "Hey Tess, it's Grandma. Everything is okay. I'm coming home. See you soon." There was something off about that call. It was as if she was trying to reassure us, but her tone felt strangely flat, almost distant. We tried calling Grandma's phone right after we heard the call, but there was no answer. We called again the next day, still nothing. Worry grew, so my parents arranged for a wellness check. I remember riding in the car as we headed to her apartment, a modest place just a few minutes off the base, upstairs from a store called Silver Bullet. I remember that building well. I'd even bought a few Pokemon packs there. When we got to her apartment, Dad led the way. He stepped inside first, paused at the living room entrance, and then quickly told Mom and me to wait in the mudroom. I peered through the doorway and saw her lying on the floor. My grandma was there, motionless, with her tongue slightly protruding and her eyes staring blankly. I remember that shocking image for a split second before Dad hurried me out of there. He said nothing more, just that we needed to leave immediately. Later, we learned that she had been dead for about a week. It was a heart attack, or at least that's what my parents told me. The phone call, coming just the day before, made us wonder if it was her final way of saying goodbye, or warning us in some way we could never fully understand. I never saw her again.